She stood in the marble lobby of the $46 billion real estate company, clutching her application with trembling hands. But she had no idea her poor husband, the man she'd mocked for years, had actually inherited this very empire. The divorce papers sat in her designer purse, ready to be served at his award ceremony tonight. But what she didn't know was that the ceremony was for him, not some random colleague. She planned to marry his boss, the man she thought owned everything, but the boss was actually just an employee. Her poor husband had hidden his inheritance perfectly, but tonight at that award ceremony, when she tried to humiliate him in front of everyone, he would do something that would shatter her world completely. Would she survive the revelation that the poor man she'd divorced was worth $46 billion? Would his mistress, the woman she thought was stealing him, turn out to be someone entirely unexpected? Would her application to work at his company become the ultimate irony? Jennifer Walsh had never felt more confident in her life as she walked through the revolving glass doors of Montgomery Properties, but the confidence was built on a foundation of lies she'd told herself for 7 years. The building stretched 40 stories into the Chicago skyline, but she only saw it as her ticket away from the man waiting at home in their modest apartment. Her heels clicked against Italian marble, but each step took her closer to a truth that would destroy everything she thought she knew. The receptionist smiled at her with practiced politeness, but Jennifer barely noticed as she handed over her application for the senior marketing position. She'd spent 3 weeks perfecting her resume, but she'd spent 7 years perfecting her contempt for the man she'd married. Daniel Walsh had been different once, but that was before she'd decided poverty was a moral failing. He'd been kind once, but kindness didn't pay for the lifestyle she saw on Instagram. He'd loved her once, but love couldn't compete with her ambition. "Mrs. Walsh?" The receptionist's voice cut through her thoughts, but Jennifer was already planning her victory speech. "Someone will contact you within 48 hours, but I should mention that all final hiring decisions go through our CEO. Jennifer nodded absently, but she was thinking about Marcus, the tall, silver-haired executive she'd been seeing for 3 months. He'd told her he ran Montgomery Properties, but he'd been careful with his exact title. She'd assumed he was the CEO, but assumptions were about to become her downfall. He'd promised her a position once she was free, but freedom had a price she hadn't calculated. The divorce papers burned in her purse like a guilty secret, but guilt required a conscience she'd misplaced years ago. Tonight was Daniel's company event, some boring awards ceremony she'd agreed to attend months ago, but she'd decided to make it her stage. She would serve him the papers in front of his colleagues, but his colleagues weren't who she thought they were. She would announce her engagement to Marcus, but Marcus had secrets of his own. Jennifer walked back into the Chicago afternoon, but she didn't notice the bronze plaque beside the entrance. Montgomery Properties, founded 1952, current CEO, Daniel J. Walsh. Part 2, The Poor Husband. Daniel Walsh stood in his office on the 40th floor, but he was looking at a photograph from 7 years ago. Jennifer smiled at him from their wedding day, but the smile had been genuine then. Her eyes had held love then, but now they held only calculation. He'd known about Marcus for 2 months, but he'd known about her contempt for much longer. "Sir, the award ceremony preparations are complete," his assistant Lisa Chen said from the doorway, but Daniel didn't turn around. "The mayor will present you with the Humanitarian of the Year award at 7, but we've kept your identity as CEO quiet as you requested." Daniel finally turned, but his expression remained unreadable. He was 34 years old, but he'd learned to hide emotions before he'd learned to shave. His grandfather had taught him that, but his grandfather had taught him many things about wealth and responsibility. The old man had died 6 months ago, but the inheritance had been in a trust since Daniel turned 18. "Has my wife RSVP'd?" Daniel asked, but he already knew the answer. Lisa nodded carefully, but her eyes held sympathy she tried to hide. "Yes, sir. She confirmed for 2, but she didn't specify who her +1 would be. Should we—" "No," Daniel interrupted, but his voice remained soft. "Let it play out exactly as she's planned it, but make sure the photographer captures everything. I want a complete record, but I want her to feel completely in control until the moment I choose." Lisa left quietly, but Daniel returned to the photograph. He remembered the exact moment it was taken, right after Jennifer had whispered that she'd love him even if he stayed poor forever. But she'd broken that promise gradually, one complaint at a time. She'd mocked his cheap car, but it was paid in cash. She'd ridiculed his thrift store clothes, but he'd donated millions to homeless shelters. She called him worthless, but his company had just been valued at $46 billion. The irony would have been funny if it didn't hurt so much, but Daniel had learned that wealth couldn't buy genuine love. His grandfather had warned him about this, but the old man had suggested a test. Daniel had proposed to Jennifer without revealing his inheritance, but he told himself it was about finding authentic connection. She'd said yes to the poor man, but she'd grown to hate him for staying poor. Except he'd never been poor at all, but she'd never asked the right questions. Daniel had worked at Montgomery Properties since college, but Jennifer thought he was a low-level analyst. He came home at reasonable hours, but he delegated effectively. He wore modest clothes, but he owned 6,000 custom suits in a storage facility downtown. He drove a 10-year-old Honda, but he had a collection of vintage cars she'd never seen. He lived in a small apartment, but he owned the building and 47 others across Chicago. The deception had started as a test, but it had become a prison of his own making. He'd wanted to tell her 1,000 times, but each time she'd complained about money, he'd stayed silent. He'd wanted to shower her with gifts, but each time she'd compared him to wealthier men, he'd held back. He'd wanted to prove his worth, but each time she'd mocked his perceived poverty, he'd retreated further into his double life. Marcus had complicated everything, but Marcus was also the catalyst Daniel needed. The man was his vice president of operations, but he'd been presenting himself as the CEO to Jennifer. Daniel had known within a week, but he'd let it continue. Marcus would be at tonight's ceremony, but he had no idea his boss and his mistress's husband were the same person. Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "Do I really have to go to this boring awards thing tonight? Your company events are always so depressing." He typed back, "It would mean a lot to me. Please come." Her response was immediate. "Fine, but I'm leaving early." Daniel smiled grimly, but there was no humor in it. She would leave early indeed, but not in the way she expected. Tonight would answer the question that had haunted him for 2 years. Was there anything real left between them, or had she truly only loved the man she'd thought he could become, not the man he actually was? Part 3. The Mistress. Across town, Marcus Devon prepared for the evening with the confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences. But consequences were coming for him like a freight train he couldn't see. He adjusted his bow tie in the mirror, but he didn't notice the tremor in his hands that betrayed his underlying anxiety. He'd built his affair with Jennifer on a foundation of lies, but he'd convinced himself they were necessary lies. She thought he was the CEO, but he'd never explicitly said those words. She thought he was worth billions, but he'd let her assumptions do the heavy lifting. She thought he could give her everything, but everything was owned by a man he'd never met. The peculiarity of Montgomery Properties was that the CEO was a ghost, but that ghost had very real power. Marcus had worked there for 12 years, but he'd never seen Daniel Walsh in person. All communications came through assistants, but the decisions were always brilliant. The company had tripled in value under Walsh's leadership, but the man himself remained invisible. Board meetings happened via video with the camera off, but the voice on the other end commanded absolute respect. Contracts were signed electronically, but the signature was always legally binding. Marcus had started to wonder if Daniel Walsh even existed, but the paychecks were very real. He'd started to suspect the CEO was some kind of committee or AI, but that was impossible given the personal touches in company policy. He'd finally decided that Walsh must be disfigured or disabled somehow, but he'd never dared to ask. Tonight's awards ceremony was unusual because the CEO would supposedly appear in person, but Marcus had his doubts. The rumor was that Walsh would receive some humanitarian award, but Marcus figured it would be another video appearance. He planned to use the opportunity to network, but he also planned to present Jennifer to his colleagues as his fiancée. She didn't know about that plan yet, but he'd bought a ring. She was still married, but Marcus had convinced himself that was a temporary obstacle. His phone rang, but it was Jennifer's number. "Hey, beautiful," he answered, but his voice carried more confidence than he felt. "Marcus, I need to ask you something. Jennifer said, but there was an edge to her voice he didn't recognize. I applied to Montgomery Properties today for a marketing position, but the receptionist said all final decisions go through the CEO. That's you, right? You can just approve it? Marcus hesitated, but the lie came easily after months of practice. Of course, darling, but there are protocols. I'll make sure you get the position, but we have to make it look legitimate. Can't have people saying I hired my girlfriend, you know? But wait, why do you need a job? I told you I'd take care of everything once you're free. I need my own money, Jennifer said, but her tone suggested she was testing him. I need to know I can stand on my own. But I also need to know you're really who you say you are. This CEO tonight at the ceremony, you're sure he won't interfere with my hiring? Jennifer, I am the CEO, Marcus said, but the lie was getting heavier. This person getting the award is just some figurehead, but the real power is mine. Trust me, but if you're having doubts, no doubts, Jennifer interrupted, but she was lying too. I'm serving Daniel the divorce papers tonight at his little work event, but then I'm coming to your place. We'll celebrate together, but I want you to understand, I'm burning every bridge to be with you. Marcus felt a chill he couldn't explain, but he pushed it down. I'll be waiting, but Jennifer, maybe wait until after the ceremony to serve the papers? These work events can be tricky, but I don't want any drama affecting your future at the company. Too late, Jennifer laughed, but the sound was brittle. I already told Daniel I'm doing it tonight, but not in so many words. He has no idea what's coming, but honestly, he's so pathetic he probably won't even react. I'll text you when I'm done, but it shouldn't take long. She hung up, but Marcus stood frozen in his apartment. Something felt wrong, but he couldn't identify what. Daniel Walsh, the name tickled something in his memory, but it was common enough. He'd never thought to ask Jennifer her married name, but why would he? She was leaving the man anyway, but still, the coincidence nagged at him. He pulled out his laptop and searched the employee directory, but there were 3 Daniel Walshes in the company. One was in janitorial, one in IT, but the third had no department listed. Marcus clicked on the profile, but there was no photo. The hire date was 16 years ago, but the position was listed as Analyst Special Projects. Poor bastard, Marcus muttered, but he felt a twinge of guilt. He was sleeping with the man's wife, but he'd never considered the man himself. If this was Jennifer's husband, he was probably exactly as she described, weak, poor, and forgettable. But still, Marcus made a mental note to check the seating chart for tonight, but he wanted to avoid any awkward confrontations. What Marcus didn't know was that there was no seating chart with Daniel Walsh's name on it, but there was a private box reserved for the CEO. He didn't know that the photographer Jennifer thought was documenting her triumph was actually documenting her destruction. But he'd find out soon enough. He didn't know that the ring he'd bought for Jennifer would never touch her finger, but the revelation would come before midnight. Part 4. The ceremony begins. The grand ballroom of the Chicago Hilton sparkled with crystal chandeliers, but the real drama was arriving with the guests. Jennifer walked in alone, but her eyes scanned the room for Marcus. She wore a red dress that had cost more than Daniel's monthly salary, or so she thought, but the dress would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. She clutched her purse tighter, but the divorce papers inside seemed to pulse with malicious energy. Daniel had texted that he was running late, but he'd promised to be there by 7. Jennifer checked her watch. 6:45 p.m. The award ceremony would start soon, but she planned to serve the papers during the cocktail hour. She wanted maximum witnesses, but she wanted to be gone before the boring speeches started. Jennifer, over here! Marcus waved from across the room, but his smile faltered when he saw her expression. She walked over with predatory grace, but her eyes were cold even when she kissed his cheek. I thought you'd be up on stage or something, Jennifer whispered, but her disappointment was obvious. Why are you just standing here with the regular employees? Marcus shifted uncomfortably, but he maintained his facade. I prefer to be accessible, but I'll give some remarks later. First, I wanted to introduce you to some key people. But wait, is that your husband? Jennifer turned, but her heart sank when she saw Daniel entering the ballroom. He wore the same cheap suit he'd worn to their wedding, But something was different about how he carried himself. His shoulders were back, but his face was calm. He saw her immediately, but he smiled. A small, sad smile that made her irrationally angry. "That's him," Jennifer hissed, but she was already pulling the divorce papers from her purse. "The pathetic man I'm about to humiliate. But watch how he just takes it. He never fights back. But that's why I can't stand him anymore." Marcus grabbed her arm, but his grip was weak. "Jennifer, maybe this isn't the place." "This is exactly the place," Jennifer snapped, but she was already walking toward Daniel. The crowd seemed to part for her, but she didn't notice the way people's expressions changed from curiosity to concern. She didn't see the security personnel moving into position, but she wouldn't have cared if she had. Daniel stood by the bar, but he wasn't drinking. He watched his wife approach, but his expression remained neutral. 7 years of marriage came down to this moment, but he'd prepared himself. He'd loved her once with everything he had, but love required truth, and she'd never wanted his truth. She'd wanted his poverty to be real, so her superiority could be justified, but reality was about to crash through her delusions. "Daniel," Jennifer said loudly, but every word was calculated for maximum impact. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation, but I want all your co-workers to hear this." People were definitely watching now, but Daniel simply nodded. "I've always wanted honesty between us, but go ahead, Jennifer. Say what you need to say." She thrust the divorce papers at him, but her hand was shaking with rage, not nervousness. "I want a divorce, but I want you to know that I'm leaving you for a real man. Marcus over there," she pointed dramatically, but Marcus had gone pale, "is the CEO of one of the most successful real estate companies in America. But more importantly, he's everything you're not. He's successful, but he's also generous. He's wealthy, but he also knows how to treat a woman. He's powerful, but he also makes me feel valuable." Daniel took the papers calmly, but he didn't open them. "I see, but before I respond, I have a question. Did you apply for a job at Montgomery Properties today? But did they tell you the CEO would make the final decision?" Jennifer blinked, but the question threw her off balance. "Yes, but what does that have to do with anything? Marcus already promised me the position, but I wanted to go through the proper channels to make it look legitimate." "Marcus promised you," Daniel repeated, but his eyes shifted to where Marcus stood frozen. "Marcus Devon, my vice president of operations, but definitely not my CEO. He promised you a job at my company?" The ballroom went silent, but Jennifer didn't understand what was happening yet. "Your company? Daniel, you're an analyst, but you barely make $40,000 a year. This isn't your company, but nice try at saving face." Daniel pulled out his phone, but his fingers moved with practiced efficiency. "Lisa, please bring the Montgomery Properties organizational chart to the main floor, but make sure it's the version with photographs this time." Jennifer laughed, but the sound was becoming hysterical. "What are you doing?" "This is pathetic, but I guess I shouldn't expect anything else from you." Marcus had started to move toward the exit, but 2 security guards blocked his path. He looked at Daniel with growing horror, but recognition was finally dawning. The man he'd cuckolded was the ghost CEO he'd never met, but the revelation was destroying everything he'd built. A large screen descended from the ceiling, but Jennifer was still laughing when her own face appeared on it. The image showed her in the Montgomery Properties lobby, but the timestamp was from earlier today. The video had no sound, but her body language spoke volumes. The arrogance, the entitlement, the complete certainty in her own superiority. "That's the security footage from when you applied," Daniel said quietly, but his voice carried across the silent ballroom. "But let me show you what you didn't see." The video switched to a different angle, but this one showed the bronze plaque Jennifer had walked past. "Montgomery Properties, founded 1952, current CEO, Daniel J. Walsh." Jennifer's laughter died, but her face went white. That's a coincidence, but there are probably lots of Daniel Walshes in Chicago." "There are," Daniel agreed, but he pulled up the organizational chart. "But only one who inherited a $46 billion real estate empire from his grandfather 6 months ago, though I've been running it since I was 18. Only one who's been CEO for 16 years, but who kept it quiet because he wanted to know if the woman he loved could love him for himself. Only one who watched his wife fall in love with his own employee, but who documented everything because he knew this moment would come. The chart showed Daniel's photograph at the top, but it was a professional headshot Jennifer had never seen. Below him were dozens of executives, but Marcus's name was clearly visible in a subordinate position. The structure was undeniable, but Jennifer's mind was refusing to process it. "No," she whispered, but her voice was breaking. "You're poor, but you drive a terrible car. You wear cheap suits, but you live in a tiny apartment. You can't be. You can't." "I can be exactly who I've always been," Daniel said, but there was profound sadness in his eyes. "But you never asked, Jennifer. In 7 years, you never once asked about my family, but you knew my grandfather died. You never asked about my job, but you assumed I was worthless. You never asked about my finances, but you decided I was poor. You married me thinking I was one thing, but you never tried to learn who I actually was." Part 5. The Revelation. The mayor of Chicago walked onto the stage, but she looked uncomfortable with the scene unfolding below. "Ladies and gentlemen, but perhaps we should proceed with tonight's ceremony. I'm here to present the Humanitarian of the Year award to someone who's donated over $2 billion to Chicago charities while maintaining complete anonymity. But I believe he's ready to step into the light." Jennifer swayed on her feet, but Marcus caught her arm. She jerked away from him, but her eyes were locked on Daniel. $2 billion? But we could barely pay rent. "We could barely pay rent on the apartment I chose," Daniel corrected, but his voice remained gentle. "The apartment I own, but in a building where I know all my tenants by name. We struggled because I wanted to live simply, but I was never poor, Jennifer. I was testing whether you could love me without wealth, but you failed that test years ago. I just didn't want to admit it, but I kept hoping you'd change." The screen changed again, but this time it showed photographs spanning 7 years. Daniel at charity events Jennifer had never attended, but where he'd donated millions. Daniel cutting ribbons at new affordable housing developments, but Jennifer had thought he was working late. Daniel meeting with senators and governors, but she'd assumed he was at the office doing data entry. Daniel receiving awards and recognition, but always under conditions of anonymity. "I built a shelter for homeless veterans," Daniel said, but each word seemed to cost him. "I named it after you, but you never knew because you never asked what I did with my time. I started a scholarship fund for underprivileged kids, but I used your maiden name because I thought you'd be proud. I renovated 12 low-income housing complexes, but I improved our own apartment building first because I wanted you to see that I cared about people, not just profit." Jennifer's knees buckled, but this time no one caught her. She sank into a chair, but her red dress spread around her like a pool of blood. "Why? But why would you hide this from me? Why would you let me think?" "Because I wanted you to love me," Daniel said simply, but the pain in his voice was raw. "Not my money, but me. I wanted you to choose me when I was just Daniel, but you chose to despise me instead. I wanted you to see value in kindness and integrity, but you only saw value in expensive cars and designer clothes. I wanted a partner who would build a life with me based on who we were, but you wanted a wallet with a pulse." Marcus tried to speak, but Daniel silenced him with a look. "And you, Marcus, my vice president of operations earning $400,000 a year, but apparently that wasn't enough. You wanted to be CEO, but you weren't willing to work for it. So you stole my identity, but you didn't even do that well. You told my wife you were me, but you never bothered to find out who I actually was." "I didn't know," Marcus stammered, but the excuse was pathetic even to his own ears. "Sir, I never knew you were. I thought you were just some analyst named Daniel Walsh, but I swear I didn't make the connection." "You didn't make the connection because you didn't care," Daniel said, but his voice was ice. "You saw a woman you wanted, but you didn't care that she was married. You saw an opportunity to pretend to be more than you were, but you didn't care about the consequences. You're fired, effective immediately, but the severance package you would have received is now void due to moral turpitude clause in your contract. Security will escort you out, but I suggest you find a very good lawyer." Marcus was led away, but his protests faded into background noise. The ballroom was frozen, but every eye was on Jennifer and Daniel. The mayor stood on stage uncertainly, but she seemed to realize this moment needed to play out. Jennifer looked up at her husband, her soon-to-be ex-husband, but for the first time in years, she really saw him. The cheap suit couldn't hide his bearing, but the bearing of someone who commanded billions. The modest haircut couldn't hide the intelligence in his eyes, but the intelligence that had built an empire. The gentle voice couldn't hide the steel underneath, but the steel of someone who'd made impossible decisions and lived with the consequences. "What happens now?" Jennifer asked, but her voice was small and broken. Daniel pulled out the divorce papers she'd given him, but he didn't look at them. "Now I sign these, but I want you to understand something first. I would have given you everything, but you had to want me first. I would have shown you the truth years ago, but every time I tried, you said something that made me doubt your love. I wanted to believe in us, but you made it impossible." He pulled out a pen, a cheap plastic pen, but Jennifer recognized it from their wedding day and signed the papers with steady hands. "You'll receive a settlement of $5 million, but that's more than fair given the prenuptial agreement you signed. You claimed you'd love me even if we stayed poor forever, but that prenup protected my assets in case you were lying. Turns out you were, but at least I was prepared." Jennifer's mind reeled, but she grasped at the one detail that didn't make sense. "The prenup? But we didn't sign a prenup. Check the marriage license paperwork, but it was included in the packet my lawyer prepared. You signed it without reading. But you were so eager to marry me that you didn't care what you were signing. It's perfectly legal, but it means you leave this marriage with $5 million and nothing else. The apartment you think we struggled to afford? Mine, but you'll need to move out. The car you mocked? Mine, but you never contributed to its maintenance. The life you despised? Mine, but you were just a guest who outstayed her welcome." He turned to address the ballroom, but his voice carried absolute authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, but I apologize for the disruption. My personal life has intersected with this ceremony in an unfortunate way, but I hope we can proceed. Madam Mayor, I'm ready to accept the award, but I want to dedicate it to everyone who's been working beside me for years without knowing who I was. You treated me with respect when you thought I was nobody, but that means more than any award." The mayor recovered her composure, but she beckoned Daniel to the stage. He walked up with quiet dignity, but Jennifer watched from her seat in horror. The man she'd called worthless was receiving recognition from the city's highest official, but she'd thrown him away like garbage. "Daniel Walsh," the mayor said, but her voice was warm with genuine respect, "has transformed Chicago through his anonymous generosity, but today he steps into the light. His company has created 15,000 jobs, but his personal donations have helped 50,000 families. He's renovated entire neighborhoods, but he's never sought recognition. He's the embodiment of true philanthropy. But more than that, he's shown us that character matters more than credit." The applause was thunderous, but Jennifer couldn't hear it over the roaring in her ears. She watched Daniel accept the Crystal Award, but she was seeing the ghost of every cruel word she'd ever said to him. She watched him shake hands with dignitaries, but she was remembering every time she'd mocked his perceived poverty. She watched him smile humbly, but she was realizing she'd never really known him at all. Part 6. The Aftermath. Jennifer fled the ballroom, but the photographer Daniel had mentioned captured her every step. She made it to the street before the tears came, but they came hard and fast. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, but she deleted it without reading. She'd burned her life to the ground, but she'd used someone else's identity as the match. A black car pulled up beside her, but she ignored it until the window rolled down. Lisa Chen sat in the back seat, but her expression was professionally neutral. "Mrs. Walsh, but Mr. Walsh asked me to ensure you got home safely. May I offer you a ride?" "I don't need his charity," Jennifer spat, but even she could hear how hollow the words sounded. "It's not charity," Lisa said quietly, but there was something like pity in her eyes. "It's closure, but it's also kindness. Daniel could have destroyed you publicly, but he chose mercy. He could have contested the divorce, but he's setting you free. He could have left you with nothing, but he's giving you enough to start over. That's not charity, Mrs. Walsh. That's grace." Jennifer got in the car, but she couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. They drove through Chicago in silence, but every building seemed to mock her. How many of them did Daniel own? How many businesses had she passed daily without knowing her poor husband controlled them? How many times had she complained about money while sitting on a fortune she'd been too blind to see? "Can I ask you something?" Jennifer finally said, but her voice was hoarse from crying. "Did everyone know? But was I the only one who didn't know who he really was?" Lisa considered her words carefully, but honesty seemed warranted. "Most employees don't know Daniel personally, but everyone knows the CEO is generous and brilliant. The executive team knows him, but they respect his privacy. I've worked for him for 8 years, but I've never seen him be cruel until tonight. And even tonight, he wasn't cruel. He was just honest. But honesty can hurt worse than cruelty when you've been living a lie." "I loved him once," Jennifer whispered, but she wasn't sure if it was true. "Or I thought I did, but maybe I only loved what I thought he'd become. Maybe I never loved him at all, but just the potential I saw in him." "He loved you truly," Lisa said, but her tone was final. "I've seen him look at your photograph with such tenderness, but also such sadness. He wanted to tell you the truth so many times, but he was afraid. He thought if you couldn't love him poor, you'd only love his money rich. But either way, he'd lose the real you. Turns out there was no real you to lose, but that's not his fault." The car stopped at the apartment building, but Jennifer looked at it with new eyes. It was well-maintained and clean, but she'd always seen it as a symbol of failure. Now she saw it as a choice, Daniel's choice to live among the people he served, but she'd been too arrogant to understand. "What happens to my job application?" Jennifer asked, but the question was absurd even as she spoke it. Lisa's smile was thin, but not unkind. "It's been rejected, but I think you knew that. You'll receive the settlement Daniel mentioned, but I'd suggest using it wisely. $5 million is more than most people see in a lifetime, but it can disappear quickly if you're not careful. Daniel is being generous, but he won't be giving you more." Jennifer got out of the car, but she turned back one last time. Tell him I'm sorry, but I know it doesn't matter. Tell him I finally see what I threw away, but I know it's too late. Tell him." "I'll tell him you said goodbye," Lisa interrupted gently but firmly. "That's all he needs to hear, but honestly, I think he already knew. He's good at reading people, but you were the only one he couldn't figure out. He kept hoping you'd surprise him, but you surprised him in exactly the wrong way." Part 7. What he did. 3 months later, Jennifer sat in a coffee shop reading the Chicago Tribune, but the headline made her hands shake. "Mystery CEO's ex-wife launches nonprofit with divorce settlement." The article was about her, but she'd never spoken to any reporter. The story detailed how she'd used her $5 million settlement to start a foundation helping women transition out of toxic relationships. But the focus was on her transparency about her own mistakes. The foundation was called Second Sight, but the name was both ironic and appropriate. What Jennifer didn't know, what the article didn't mention, was that Daniel had anonymously donated an additional $20 million to her foundation, but he'd done it through a network of shell companies she'd never trace. He'd seen her first interview where she'd broken down admitting her own cruelty, but he'd been moved by her genuine remorse. He still wouldn't take her back, but he could help her become someone better. The article continued. Jennifer Walsh admits she destroyed her marriage through her own arrogance, but she's using her experience to help others avoid the same mistakes. "I judged my husband by his bank account instead of his character," she says. "But I learned too late that character is the only currency that matters. I thought poverty was a moral failing, but I was the one who was morally bankrupt." Jennifer's phone rang, but it was a number she didn't recognize. "Hello? Mrs. Walsh, this is Gregory Morrison from the Chicago Community Foundation, but I'm calling about a significant anonymous donation to your nonprofit. Someone has given $20 million, but they've requested complete anonymity. I'm calling to verify this is legitimate, but also to congratulate you. This kind of support is extraordinary, but it suggests someone believes in your mission." Jennifer closed her eyes, but she knew exactly who the donor was. Daniel was still taking care of her, but from a distance she couldn't bridge. He was still showing her grace, but on terms she couldn't manipulate. He was still being the man she should have treasured, but to someone she could no longer be. "Please send my deepest thanks to the donor," Jennifer said carefully, but her voice broke. "Tell them I understand why they want to remain anonymous, but their generosity will change lives. Tell them I'm trying to become someone worthy of this trust, but I know I have a long way to go." She hung up and pulled out the photograph she kept in her wallet. Daniel on their wedding day, but his smile was pure and hopeful. She'd destroyed that hope, but she was slowly learning to live with the consequences. The foundation was her penance, but it was also her path forward. She couldn't undo what she'd done, but she could help others avoid her mistakes. Part 8. The Real Mistress. Daniel sat in his office reviewing the quarterly reports, but his mind wandered to the confrontation 3 months ago. He'd shocked Jennifer exactly as he'd intended, but the victory had felt hollow. He'd wanted her to see him, but seeing him had destroyed her. He'd wanted validation, but validation from someone who'd never truly known him meant nothing. Lisa knocked on his door, but she entered before he could respond. "Sir, there's someone here to see you, but she doesn't have an appointment. She says it's personal, but I thought you should know before I send her away." "Who is it?" Daniel asked, but he was already turning back to his computer. "She says her name is Rebecca Morrison," Lisa said carefully, but there was something in her tone. "She's Gregory Morrison's daughter, but she says you met at a charity event 2 years ago. She claims you promised to have coffee with her, but you never followed up." Daniel's head snapped up, but memory was flooding back. Rebecca, the architect who designed the veterans shelter, but who challenged his every assumption. Rebecca, the woman who'd argued with him for 2 hours about sustainable building practices, but who'd made him laugh for the first time in months. Rebecca, the woman he'd wanted to call, but who he'd avoided because he was still married to someone who despised him. "Send her in," Daniel said, but his heart was racing in a way it hadn't since Jennifer had said yes to his proposal. Rebecca entered, but she was exactly as he remembered, tall, confident, with eyes that saw through pretense. She wore jeans and a blazer, but she carried herself like someone who knew her worth without needing to prove it. "Mr. Walsh, but I hope this isn't too forward. I heard about your divorce, but I wanted to make sure you were okay. We didn't know each other well, but I've thought about our conversation often." Daniel stood, but he was suddenly aware of how tired he must look. "I'm okay, but I appreciate you checking. How's the shelter working out? But I heard there were some issues with the solar panels." "The panels are perfect," Rebecca interrupted, but her smile was warm. "You insisted on the best, but you were right. They're saving us thousands in energy costs, but more importantly, the veterans love having that bit of independence. You designed that detail in, but I don't think you got proper credit." "I don't need credit," Daniel said, but the words came automatically. "I just needed it to work, but the people using it deserve the best." "That's what I remember about you," Rebecca said quietly, but she took a step closer. "You cared about substance over image, but you also listened to arguments and changed your mind when presented with better ideas. You were humble enough to admit when you were wrong, but confident enough to insist on excellence. I wanted to have that coffee with you, but I knew you were married. Now you're not, but I'm probably too late anyway." Daniel looked at her carefully, but he was searching for the calculation he'd seen in Jennifer. He found none, just genuine interest, but also patience. Rebecca wasn't demanding anything, but she was offering something he'd thought he'd lost, the possibility of real connection. "I'm not ready," Daniel admitted, but honesty felt like relief. "I'm still processing everything that happened, but I'm also questioning every judgment I made about love and trust. I was married to someone for 7 years, but I never really knew her. She never really knew me either, but we built a life on assumptions and lies. I don't want to repeat that mistake, but I don't know how to avoid it." "Then don't try to avoid it," Rebecca suggested, but her tone was gentle. "Just be yourself, the real yourself, not the poor man or the rich man, but just Daniel. I already know you're wealthy, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because you're the only man I've ever met who argued with me about rebar specifications, but who also admitted when my calculations were better than his. I'm here because you remembered every veteran's name when we toured the shelter, but you also listened to their stories. I'm here because I think you're worth knowing." but I'm willing to wait until you're ready to be known. Daniel felt something crack in his chest, but it wasn't breaking. It was opening. Coffee, he said, but the word came out rough. Just coffee, but maybe we take it slow. I need to learn how to trust again, but I also need to learn how to be honest from the beginning. No tests, but no deceptions either. Just two people getting to know each other, but with everything on the table. Rebecca's smile could have lit the city, but it was the warmth in her eyes that undid him. Coffee sounds perfect, but I should warn you, I have very strong opinions about sustainable architecture. You'll probably want to argue with me, but I hope you do. That's when I saw who you really were, when you were passionate about making things better, not just making them expensive. Part 9. 1 year later, Jennifer stood at the ribbon cutting for her foundation's 10th shelter, but the crowd was modest compared to Daniel's events. The mayor wasn't there, but the local alderman had come. The press wasn't there, but a few bloggers had shown up. She'd learned to measure success differently, but the lesson had been expensive. She'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Daniel was dating someone, but she didn't know who. She'd heard his company had hit $50 billion in valuation, but she didn't know the details. She'd heard he was happy, but she tried not to think about what that meant. She had her own life now, but it was built on the ruins of the one she'd destroyed. Ms. Walsh? A young woman approached nervously, but she held a worn folder. I wanted to thank you, but I don't know if you remember me. I came to one of your workshops 6 months ago, but I was still with my husband then. You told me that recognizing the problem was the first step, but that I had to decide what to do about it. I left him last month, but I'm rebuilding my life now. Your foundation gave me the grant that's letting me go back to school, but more than that, you gave me hope. Jennifer felt tears prick her eyes, but they were different from the ones she'd cried at Daniel's award ceremony. These tears came from purpose, but also from understanding. I'm so proud of you, but I want you to know you did the hard part. I just helped with resources, but you had the courage. That's all yours, but don't forget it. The young woman left, but Jennifer stood alone for a moment. She pulled out her phone and did something she'd resisted for a year. She searched for Daniel Walsh. The top result was a photo from a charity gala, but he wasn't alone. The woman beside him was beautiful in an understated way, but more importantly, she was looking at Daniel like he'd hung the moon. Daniel was looking back at her the same way, but there was something else in his expression. Peace. The caption identified her as Rebecca Morrison, but Jennifer recognized the name. The architect who'd designed the veterans' shelter, but who'd fought with Daniel over every detail. The woman who'd won awards for sustainable building, but who'd donated most of her fees to charity. The woman who was Daniel's equal in every way that mattered, but who'd chosen him for who he was, not what he had. Jennifer closed the phone, but she didn't feel the jealousy she'd expected. Instead, she felt something like gratitude. Daniel had found what she'd been too broken to give him, but he'd found it with someone worthy. She'd learned from her mistakes, but the best use of that learning was to help others. She couldn't undo the past, but she could build a different future. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I saw the news about your 10th shelter. Well done. I hope you're finding peace, but I also hope you're finding yourself. The foundation is doing important work, but you're doing the most important work on yourself. Be well. Jennifer stared at the message for a long time, but she finally typed back, Thank you. I hope you found happiness, but I know you have. She's lucky, but more importantly, you chose someone who sees you. I never did. But I'm learning to see people now. It's the only good thing that came from breaking us. Jay. The response came quickly. We were already broken, but we broke together instead of healing separately. I don't regret loving you, but I regret that you couldn't love who I actually was. I'm glad you're learning, but I'm more glad you're helping others learn too. This is the last time we'll speak, but I wanted you to know. I forgive you, not for you, but for me. Dear E.D. Jennifer read the message 3 times, but she didn't respond. There was nothing left to say, but everything had already been said. Daniel had given her one last gift, forgiveness she didn't deserve, but which set them both free. She deleted the messages, but she kept the lesson. Character is the only currency that matters, but she'd learned that truth too late to save her marriage. She wouldn't make that mistake again, but more importantly, she'd help others avoid it too. Epilogue: 3 years later, Daniel Walsh stood in the hospital room, but his hands were shaking as he held his newborn daughter. Rebecca slept in the bed beside him, but her face was peaceful despite the exhaustion. The baby, Emma Rose Walsh, looked up at him with unfocused eyes, but Daniel saw infinite possibility in them. "I'm going to tell you the truth about everything," he whispered, but his voice was thick with emotion. "I'm going to tell you about money and character, but I'm going to make sure you understand which matters more. I'm going to tell you about your mother, how she's brilliant and kind, but also how she chose me when I was completely honest with her. I'm going to tell you about mistakes I made, but also about grace I received. And someday, when you're old enough, I'm going to tell you about your almost stepmother, but how her biggest gift to me was showing me what I didn't want." Rebecca stirred, but her eyes opened to find Daniel cradling their daughter. "What are you telling her, but more importantly, are you promising her a pony? Because we discussed the pony situation, but I thought we agreed to wait until she could walk." Daniel laughed, but the sound was pure joy. "No ponies yet, but I'm promising her honesty. I'm promising her that she'll know both her parents completely, but that we'll never ask her to choose between truth and love. She can have both, but we'll make sure of it." "Good," Rebecca said, but she held out her arms for the baby. "Because I'm promising her that too, but I'm also promising her that her father is the best man I know. Not because he's wealthy, but because he's good. Not because he's powerful, but because he's kind. Not because he has everything, but because he chooses to give everything to the people who need it most." The hospital room door opened, but Lisa Chen entered with a massive bouquet. "Sir, these just arrived, but the card says they're from the Second Sight Foundation. Should I read it, or is it private?" "Read it," Daniel said, but he was curious despite himself. Lisa opened the card and read, "Congratulations on the birth of your daughter, but also congratulations on building the life you deserved. The foundation has helped over 5,000 women in 3 years, but we're naming our next program the Emma Rose Initiative in honor of your daughter. We hope she grows up knowing that second chances are possible, but also that first choices matter most. With gratitude for the second chance you gave one woman to become someone better." The Second Sight Foundation. Rebecca looked at Daniel curiously, but she didn't ask the obvious question. He told her everything about Jennifer, but he'd also told her about the anonymous donations he'd made. Rebecca had understood both the generosity and the pain, but she'd never judged either. "That's beautiful," Rebecca said finally, but she smiled at her husband. "Your daughter's already making a difference, but she learned it from her father. The man who gives anonymously, but who also gives completely. The man who was tested and found lacking a partner, but who learned and found me. The man who could have been bitter, but who chose grace instead." Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, but his family was complete around him. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the poverty he'd chosen, but also the wealth he'd inherited, the wife who'd despised him, but also the woman who'd chosen him, the public humiliation, but also the private peace, the ending that had felt like destruction, but which had actually been liberation. "What are you thinking about?" Rebecca asked, but she already knew her husband's contemplative silences. "I'm thinking that I shocked Jennifer that night," Daniel said slowly, but he was choosing his words carefully. "I revealed the truth she'd never seen, but I also revealed the truth about who she'd become. What I did shocked her, but what she did shocked me more. She actually learned from it. She actually changed, but she used her destruction to build something meaningful. I wanted to hurt her, but instead I accidentally helped her. That's grace I didn't intend, but which worked anyway." "You're a good man," Rebecca said simply, but the words carried weight. "You could have destroyed her completely, but you gave her enough to rebuild. You could have gloated, but you gave anonymously. You could have moved on without looking back, but you sent one last message of forgiveness. That's not shock, darling. That's mercy. But it's also strength, because mercy requires more courage than revenge." Daniel looked down at his daughter. But Emma Rose had fallen asleep in her mother's arms. She was perfect and innocent, but she was also the culmination of every choice he'd made. The choice to be honest with Rebecca from the start, but the choice to learn from his mistakes with Jennifer. The choice to build a real relationship, but on a foundation of truth instead of tests. The choice to believe in love again, but with open eyes instead of hopeful blindness. I hope I can teach her everything she needs to know, Daniel said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. I hope I can show her how to be strong but kind, but how to be wealthy but generous. I hope I can protect her from people who only see dollar signs. But how do I do that without repeating my own mistakes? Rebecca took his hand, but her grip was firm and certain. You teach her by being yourself, but you also teach her by loving her completely. You show her that character matters by having character yourself, but you also show her that honesty is possible by being honest with her. You protect her by giving her the tools to protect herself, but you also trust her to make her own choices. She'll make mistakes, but she'll learn from them just like you did. Just like I did, but just like even Jennifer did. The baby stirred, but her tiny hand wrapped around Daniel's finger. In that moment, Daniel understood what he'd been searching for all along, not validation from someone who couldn't see him, but connection with someone who saw him completely. Not tests to prove worthiness, but trust to build partnership. Not shock value to force recognition, but quiet certainty and mutual understanding. Jennifer had asked what he would do, but what he'd done had shocked her into transformation. She'd expected him to crumble, but he'd revealed an empire. She'd expected him to beg, but he'd granted freedom. She'd expected poverty, but she'd discovered wealth she'd stood on without seeing. The shock had been total, but it had been necessary for both of them, but in different ways. Daniel had learned that hiding truth was its own form of dishonesty, but he'd also learned that forcing someone to see truth could be an act of mercy. He'd learned that love without honesty was just convenient fiction, but he'd also learned that honesty without love was just cruelty. He'd found the balance with Rebecca, but he'd needed Jennifer to teach him where the balance wasn't. She's perfect, Daniel whispered, but he was talking about his daughter and his wife and his life. Everything is perfect, but I had to go through everything imperfect to get here. I had to be poor to understand wealth, but I had to be wealthy to understand poverty. I had to be hidden to appreciate being seen, but I had to be revealed to understand the cost of deception. I had to shock someone into seeing me, but I had to be shocked into seeing myself. Rebecca kissed his cheek, but her eyes were bright with understanding. And now you see yourself clearly, but you also see the future. Our daughter will grow up knowing both her parents completely, but she'll never doubt she's loved for exactly who she is. She'll see you give to charity, but she'll also see you give to her. She'll see you run a company, but she'll also see you run toward home. She'll see you as powerful, but she'll also see you as present. That's what you're giving her, but it's what you couldn't give Jennifer because she couldn't see it. In a small office across town, Jennifer read about the birth announcement, but she smiled genuinely for the first time in years. The Second Sight Foundation was thriving, but she'd recently started dating a teacher who'd attended one of her workshops. He knew her whole story, but he'd chosen her anyway. Not despite her mistakes, but because she'd learned from them. She'd finally learned what Daniel had tried to teach her. That character is built in how you respond to failure, but failure is only permanent if you refuse to grow. She closed her laptop, but she pulled out a photograph she kept hidden in her desk. Daniel on their wedding day, but younger and hopeful. She'd destroyed that hope, but she'd built something new from the ashes. The foundation had her last name, but it had Daniel's values. She'd never stop owing him for the shock that had saved her, but she'd never stop trying to pay that debt forward. The story of the poor husband who'd actually inherited the $46 billion real estate company, but who'd been divorced by a wife who'd applied to his own company without knowing it, that story had become legend in Chicago. The wife who'd tried to leave him for his mistress at his award ceremony, but who'd discovered the mistress was just an employee and the poor husband was the actual CEO. That story was whispered in business schools as a cautionary tale. What he'd done to shock her, the revelation, the public exposure, the graceful severance, That story was debated in ethics classes. But the real story, the one only 3 people truly knew, was simpler. A man had hidden himself to find authentic love, but he'd found authentic contempt instead. A woman had revealed her true character when tested, but she'd failed the test completely. A shock had been delivered and received, but both parties had been transformed by it. One had found real love after artificial testing, but the other had found real purpose after artificial living. And in the end, what Daniel had done to shock Jennifer wasn't the revelation of his wealth, but the gift of his forgiveness. He'd given her enough to rebuild, but not enough to coast. He'd given her mercy, but not absolution. He'd given her a second chance, but he'd made her work for it. That was the real shock. Not that he was rich, but that he was better than she'd ever imagined. Not that he'd succeeded, but that he'd succeeded without her. Not that he'd moved on, but that he'd moved on to someone who could actually see him. Jennifer had learned too late that the man she'd mocked was worth $46 billion, but she'd learned just in time that she needed to rebuild herself before she could build anything else. Daniel had learned too late that his wife only loved his potential, but he'd learned just in time to find someone who loved his reality. And Emma Rose Walsh would grow up knowing her father's story, but she'd grow up in a home built on truth instead of tests, on honesty instead of hiding, on love that was earned through authenticity instead of extracted through deception. The shock of revelation had freed them all, but freedom always costs something. For Jennifer, it cost her marriage but bought her purpose. For Daniel, it cost his idealism but bought him reality. For Rebecca, it cost nothing but gave her everything. And for Emma Rose, it would cost her ignorance but buy her wisdom. The wisdom that wealth means nothing without character, but character means everything even without wealth. That was the lesson of the poor husband who wasn't poor, but who'd pretended to be. That was the lesson of the wife who'd applied to his company, but who'd never applied herself to knowing him. That was the lesson of the mistress who wasn't a mistress, but who'd become a wife. That was the lesson of the shock that wasn't cruelty, but mercy disguised as revelation. And that was the lesson that would echo through generations. Be honest from the start, but be prepared for honesty to hurt. Test character if you must, but be ready for the test to reveal your own. Shock people with truth if necessary, but remember that truth is a weapon that cuts both ways. And above all, remember that love built on lies will crumble under truth, but love built on truth will stand through anything. Daniel Walsh had learned all these lessons, but he'd paid for them with 7 years of a false marriage. Jennifer Walsh had learned all these lessons too, but she'd paid for them with everything she'd thought she wanted. And both of them had emerged transformed, not into better versions of who they'd been, but into honest versions of who they'd always actually been. That was what he'd done to shock her, but the shock had reverberated far beyond one night in a ballroom. It had created waves that were still spreading, but the waves were carrying hope instead of harm, possibility instead of pain, truth instead of deception. And in the end, that was the greatest shock of all, that destruction could lead to creation, that exposure could lead to growth, that the ending of one story could be the beginning of something infinitely better. The $46 billion empire would continue to grow, but it would be run by a man who'd learned that money was just a tool. The foundation would continue to help women, but it would be run by a woman who learned that character was the only currency. The marriage would continue to deepen, but it would be built by 2 people who'd learned that honesty was the only foundation. And the child would grow up understanding all of it, but she'd grow up safe in the knowledge that her parents had learned their lessons well. What Daniel Walsh had done to shock Jennifer Walsh that night was simple. He'd told the truth, but the truth had been so unexpected, so complete, so devastating to her constructed reality that it had functioned as the ultimate shock. And from that shock had come growth, painful, difficult, necessary growth that had transformed them both into people capable of building something real. That was the story. That was the shock. That was the lesson. And that was the legacy that would outlive them all. Not the $46 billion, but the truth that character is the only wealth that truly matters. And honesty is the only currency that never devalues.